First up, our top focus. Israel has announced a limited ground operation against Hezbollah in Lebanon, sending its soldiers across the border. Now, in a statement, the Israel Defense Forces said its targets were located close to the border that posed an immediate threat to Israeli communities in northern Israel. It said the military operation Northern Arrows involves ground forces supported by Air Force and artillery with precise strikes. Just after midnight, consecutive blasts were heard across the Lebanese capital. Now, Hezbollah leader, Deputy Leader Naim Qasim, in a first public speech since Nasrallah's death, said the resistance forces are ready for any Israeli ground engagement. At least 95 people have been killed and 172 others have been wounded as Israeli warplanes carried out massive strikes on Beirut's southern suburbs in the last 24 hours. Now, according to the State Department, the U.S. was informed about Israel's ground operations in Lebanon. The spokesperson, Matthew Miller, said the U.S. officials were in continuous talks with their Israeli counterparts. He said, at this point, the U.S. is not evacuating Americans from Lebanon.
Look, we're not evacuating American citizens from Lebanon at this time. We always conduct a prudent planning process. We have been doing that for some months, going all the way back to October 7th, but at this time there's still commercial options available.
All right.
Meanwhile, the United Kingdom is chartering a flight to help British nationals who want to leave the region. The flight is due to leave Beirut International Airport on Wednesday. The call comes as several airlines, including Air France, Emirates, Air Algeria and Turkish Airlines have temporarily suspended flights to the region. And Brazil's President Lula da Silva has condemned the Israeli strike on Lebanon. Also, the Turkish President Tayyip Recep Erdogan called on the United Nations to recommend the use of force in case the Security Council fails to stop Israel's attacks on Lebanon. Meanwhile, the European Union renewed its calls for an immediate ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel.
This is a moment of truth for Lebanon. Certainly, it's a moment of truth for this country caught in the middle of a war. And the European Union has to collectively commit to preserve its state institutions of the risk of collapsing.
All right, for more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who joins us on the broadcast from Canberra. Dr. Malcolm Davis, thanks very much indeed for talking to WION. Now, let me begin by saying that West Asia is really at an inflection point at this moment. The question then is, will Netanyahu go for a wider Lebanon war or only limit himself to southern Lebanon?
Look, I think at this point in time that he is going to focus on southern Lebanon. His goal is to force Hezbollah back to the Litani River, which runs in parallel to the Lebanese-Israeli border, about a distance of 30 kilometers or so. And that gives Israel a buffer from which they can then protect their citizens in northern Israel and allow them to return to their towns and villages in northern Israel. Obviously, the airstrikes are going to continue in terms of going after Hezbollah missile and rocket capabilities across Lebanon. But I certainly don't see Israel extending this ground incursion into a full-scale invasion and ending up basically in a ground war in Lebanon like they had last time, where they took heavy casualties.
Malcolm Davis, Dr. Malcolm Davis, to many it looks like Netanyahu is on a rampage. You've had a strike in Iran, you're fighting, of course, in Gaza, and you're now doing a limited ground offensive in Lebanon. Do you fight guerrilla warfare with wide-scale ground invasions? I mean, given the fact that they're not really using precision bombing, there are bunker buster bombs that are being used that are leading to heavy civilian casualties as well.
Well, I wouldn't call this a rampage. I mean, let's start at the beginning here in terms of October the 7th, which was an attack on Israel undertaken by Hamas with the sponsorship of Iran that caused about 1,250 Israeli casualties and saw huge atrocities being committed against Israeli citizens. On October the 8th, Hezbollah began launching large rocket and artillery attacks against northern Israel. So Israel, I think, has been quite restrained against Hezbollah. It's been quite restrained against Iran. In April, we saw an exchange of fire between Israel and Iran, primarily because Iran was retaliating against an attack by Israel into Lebanon against Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders. So I think that it's not a rampage, it's Israel defending itself, and it's going to the fullest extent that it can, using its conventional military forces to win this war as effectively as possible, because the Israelis do understand that groups like Hamas, groups like Hezbollah, and Iran's government do seek the actual destruction of Israel in the literal sense. And, having gone through the Holocaust in the Second World War, they're not prepared to tolerate a second Holocaust in the 21st century.
Dr. Malcolm Davis.
So I do understand exactly where the Israelis are coming from.
Dr. Malcolm Davis, I beg to differ that this is cannot obviously be compared to the Holocaust, but certainly many believe this is a genocide in itself. If you compare the number of deaths on October 7 to the number of deaths we're seeing in Gaza and now in Lebanon that are rising by the day, and we don't know how long this war in Lebanon will continue, there is a collateral, that is the civilian deaths, and certainly a very high number even in today's warfare. But I want to move on to that. Yes.
Certainly, let me make this point. Look, I support Israel's right to defend itself. I don't necessarily support Israel's approach to defending itself, where it's using military force in a way that does cause civilian casualties. There are things called the laws of armed conflict that require discrimination, proportionality, and necessity. And you can make an argument, I think, that Israel is undertaking its military actions in a way that violates those laws of armed conflict. Having said that, Israel is certainly recognizing that its opponents seek its destruction, and no one can argue against that, because Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran have all made it very clear that they seek the annihilation of Israel. When they talk about death to the Jews, that's exactly what they're meaning. So let's not equivocate on that.
No, absolutely not. But I don't think that this war is going anywhere if this continues to grow into a regional crisis. And many believe that America's policy on this has been piecemeal. The Biden administration is talking about negotiations on one hand, but also sending money and munitions to Israel, repeatedly. So there is some conflict there in the approach of the Americans and the West as well.
Well, yes. The Americans are obviously supporting Israel. They always will. And I think that when you look at the enemies that the Israelis are up against, terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, and rogue states like Iran that is, within weeks of acquiring a nuclear weapon, I quite understand why the Americans are supporting Israel.
But this is a very lopsided war, isn't it? We keep talking about the annihilation of Israel, but that isn't the reality. If you compare the warfare and the military strength of Israel to these groups, it can't be compared literally. So we're seeing, therefore, the effect of that is being seen in the civilian lives being lost on the other side in this war. But what really next for West Asia, for this ground offensive going forward? What do you see in the next couple of weeks that's going to happen?
Well, look, I think in part it depends on how Israel conducts the coming weeks in its war against Hezbollah. I think the second point is, what does Iran do? Iran has held off from intervening on a large scale after Israel's attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. In doing so, it's losing credibility in the eyes of the groups like Hezbollah and Hamas that it sponsors. But if it does intervene in the war, if it does join the war on the side of Hezbollah and Hamas, then it's highly likely that Israel would attack Iran's nuclear facilities. And the key concern of Israel here is that Iran is within a few weeks of acquiring sufficient fissile material for a nuclear weapon. And if we're talking existential threats to Israel's existence, it would only take 2 or 3 nuclear weapons to literally wipe out Israel as a nation state and eliminate the entire population. So from an Israeli perspective, they cannot allow Iran under any circumstances to acquire nuclear weapons. I think the Iranians don't want to necessarily tempt an Israeli strike. So the Iranians probably will hold back from supporting Hezbollah and Hamas, but at the price of doing so will be their credibility in the eyes of the groups that they sponsor.
Right. I mean, India has been fighting infiltration for decades here in Jammu and Kashmir. We're certainly not going to be bombing our neighbor Pakistan for that. But Malcolm Davis, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the broadcast. I mean, at the moment, a lot of people in the world think that Netanyahu is more trigger happy than anybody else at the moment. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.